There's been an awful lot of talk about whether I would or would not even rape Jess Phillips. I've been in a lot of trouble for my hardline stance of not even raping her. I suppose with enough pressure, I might cave. But let's be honest, nobody's got that much beer.
On the 10th of May 2019, The Times published an exclusive interview with Jess Phillips, Labour MP for Birmingham Yardley, who disclosed that she was planning to table proposals, likely to have cross-party backing, for changes to the electoral rules that could ban people from standing for election if they behave as UKIP's Carl Benjamin has behaved towards her. The purpose of this video is to consider why such a course of action has the potential to create a significant chilling factor on open public discourse and lead to Phillips's own disqualification from any and all democratically elected roles. In part 1, we considered the merits of the Court of Public Opinion charges levelled against Carl Benjamin, following a framework of 5 proposed assumptions about public discourse between adults in the age of so-called Twitter mobs. And having first considered the assumption that freedom of expression also involves responsibility, consequences, and a right of reply, we determined that the Fawcett Society's call for Benjamin to be banned from participating in elections in perpetuity could be successful in the context of being prepared to willfully ignore any and all relevant context for the purpose of criminalising offensive comedy. And that if Benjamin's name must be the first to be added to some sort of stunning and brave new world style public election disqualification offence register, then it logically follows that Jess Phillips could be next. The purpose of this video is to examine exactly why that would be, as well as to continue our exploration of concepts of comedy involving the extremely emotive subject of sexual violence, and consider when it might be seen to cross the line between words and violence.
I think we need to have a presumption that free speech is the standard against which everything would be measured. We also need to have a presumption of innocence rather than a presumption of guilt. So you have to demonstrate guilt beyond doubt. And thirdly, I think you should be very, very careful in public life to make sure that various pressure groups don't use things as essentially as a veto over what can and can't be said and what can and can't be discussed. So if a pressure group or somebody who represents a pressure group seizes on something and pushes it very hard, you should be very, very sceptical about that.
Do you mean jokes about rape? She said, yes. I went, depends on the joke. Fucking does. No, it does. I was going, no, it does. It does. Depends on the joke. I said, of course it does. It's about context. It's about the content, right? I said, what do you mean by a rape joke? And she said, even a joke with the word rape in it is unacceptable.
Benjamin's words can and have been interpreted as unreasonable and offensive by a great many people. However, it is also reasonable and relevant to consider the motives of those who have seized his words the tightest, and the potential special interest to be served from pushing certain cherry-picked statements particularly hard.
Why rape though?
Clearly, Phillips stands as Benjamin's most immediate and most consistent accuser, followed by the Fawcett Society, and more generally the army of feminists Phillips did very publicly threaten to bring down on Benjamin's head. We'll consider some possible relevant motives and benefits and conflicts of interest when we explore the concepts of equality of opportunity and of outcome that 3 of his most enthusiastic accusers claim to espouse. But I suspect that the notion that Jess Phillips and her army of feminists might somehow benefit from the disavowment, silencing, and even possible criminalisation of one of the UK's most popular self-identifying anti-feminists will hardly be a challenging concept to most. So never mind about all them, let's talk about the mainstream media instead. If you think that Jess Phillips has been especially keen to re-examine the intention and meaning behind Benjamin's now 4-year-old very public anti-rape threat, then you probably haven't been paying close attention. Because the fact that various sections of the media have been rather loudly discussing whether or not it is or isn't appropriate for a pro-Brexit male-centrist European election candidate to have once joked about whether he would, or more accurately wouldn't, rape a named female anti-Brexit pro-socialist MP, all does rather beg the question that, given, as they clearly acknowledge, that we are all talking about a 4-year-old joke, why on earth did the exact same media spend the previous 3 years describing it as a credible threat to rape? And worse still, exploit it as a springboard to repeatedly push and promote the perception that it is possible for a female member of parliament to receive over 600 written threats to rape in one 24-hour period via the easily searchable and very public platform that is Twitter, and that not only have the combined forces of the West Midlands, Wiltshire and Metropolitan Police been entirely unable to secure one single prosecution, but that every single perpetrator proposing rape managed to get away without so much as a telling off by their social media provider. And indeed, had it not occurred to them, or at the very least to some of the politicians and activists who appear to have happily played along, that pushing such a dubious and clearly conflated perspective might just be enough to put some young woman off public participation in politics for life. According to the current deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats, it is at least partly because members of Parliament can't be expected to be responsible for the accuracy of headlines attributed in their name. But clearly, serious answers to such serious questions generally tend to be a tad more nuanced than that. Certainly, accurate and ethical journalism can be corrupted by activism and the particular political perspectives and personal prejudices of the people within their ranks. Certainly, some journalists do all too clumsily or heavy-handedly inject their own politics into proceedings. And certainly, some may very well share very similar perspectives or self-interests as someone like Jess Phillips, while others may simply have set their controls to cut and paste. But even so, it still doesn't explain why practically every brand of mainstream media from across the political spectrum, including the likes of Russia Today, would with hypnotic regularity promote such a brazenly fake news headline about something as super serious as credible threats to rape. I attempted to unpick that particular puzzle in a previous episode of The Glass Blind Spot, which essentially concluded that the self-interests of established legacy media corporations align with calls for tighter regulation of online media platforms, utilised by independent entrepreneurs like Benjamin, who are increasingly eating into their market share, something which Benjamin even alluded to in his brief statement to the press on his motivations for entering proper public life.
I mean, really, I'm just here to kind of mock the legacy media. Your numbers are going down every day and our numbers are going up, right? Like, combined, the YouTubers are getting like 30 million views a month. You're dying. And it's because, do you know what your rating is on Trustpilot, business review site? 84% 84% 1 star for the BBC, 59% 1 star for ITV, and 72% 1 star for Channel 4. I don't care what you say. You are just smear merchants. Not one of you can tell me what I believe. Not one of you knows. But all of the public know, because they can go to my YouTube channel, Saga McCad, and just watch for themselves. I've been doing this for 5 years. I have nearly 1 million subscribers. Just go and have a look. I'm not answering your questions. I'm not apologising for anything. You dirty, dirty smear merchants. Get there.
But regardless, the central purpose of proposing caution when it comes to a person's most enthusiastic accusers is simply to consider the sincerity of their claim and the possibility that their issue might be more with the actual person than with the actual actions for which they stand accused. For example, in part 1 we considered the testimony of 3 of Benjamin's critics who, in their capacity as experienced stand-up comedians, proposed that under no possible circumstances would they personally joke or laugh about the subject of rape because of the potential impact of bringing up that specific subject in a room where there will quite probably be someone who has experienced the actual trauma of sexual assault. And while they ultimately accepted the importance of the free speech principle, from their perspective, anyone crossing their red line should be condemned as an inconsiderate, self-absorbed idiot who has no measure of a room.
So, And I even said to her, I said, no, I agree real rape jokes where they're fucking horrible and the victim is the target. They're disgusting. I'd never tell those. But it depends on the joke, not the word or the subject, right? And I think I calmed it down. I said, and they agreed, yeah, some jokes are worse than others, right? And she ended it with saying, well, okay, I see your point, but still, I will laugh at a joke with the word rape in it when I know that no one in the audience has been raped.
Okay, Nish, is there any things that's totally off limits for you?
I mean, I have no idea what the angle of me telling a funny rape joke is. Like, I have no idea. Bridget Christie has one superb line, which is, there's a statistic that a lot of women have rape fantasies, and I have one as well, but it involves higher conviction rates. And you're like, but you're like, but even before you get into the subject matter, that is a perfectly written joke.
A perfectly written joke about rape, conveyed and laughed at in a room with a woman who just 10 minutes previously disclosed the fact that she was a victim of sexual assault. Now, in fairness, Nish Kumar and Joylyn Rubinstein may very well consider that last observation to be a tiny bit harsh. And while it may very well expose them by their very own standards as inconsiderate, self-absorbed idiots with no measure of a room, the main purpose of drawing attention to Bridget Christie's perfectly written rape joke is to highlight just how easily such supposedly sacred red lines tend to shift. In this case, from absolute veto to some sort of nuance about direction and target.
Yeah. But it's the target, isn't it?
She's picked the target. She's picked the target.
Everything about the target.
And it's her. Part of the reason that it gets such a laugh is there is a gasp in the room that Bridget Christie is saying, I have a rape fan like that. Immediately you're like, what the and then it's the tension and release. But why would you...
But there's a fundamental thing about that joke, isn't it? Because what she's talking about is the criminal justice instance.
Yeah.
A de facto punching up.
Yeah.
Raped victim, de facto punching
and also,
down.
There's no law against me making any of these jokes. Mm-hmm. And that's good.
Marcus Meechan and his Nazi pug might be inclined to disagree with that last assertion. And of course, the Fawcett Society are currently lobbying government to criminalise jokes that can be perceived as promoting rape or violence. Although, in truth, it's difficult to determine where exactly it is that Fawcett want to move the red line to. Their petition is calling for a lifetime ban from standing for elected office for those who promote or issue threats of rape or violence, as well as financial penalties for parties who do not deselect politicians who have been judged to have done so. And yet, they have also asserted that the way we change the law will require some careful thought and provide exemptions for those who have used violence in pursuit of a political cause. And while Fawcett style themselves as the UK's leading charity campaigning to champion gender equality, they are in reality part of an extremely well-funded, powerful and influential lobby, exclusively championing the corner for women and girls. Which is fair enough as far as it's fair enough, but on the other hand, their petition could also be interpreted as election meddling, and a direct attempt to put pressure on UKIP to disavow one specific candidate, currently standing for arguably this country's very highest current office. And their language has been noticeably gendered, speaking of banning men from election for the purpose of protecting women. So I approached Fawcett with some questions about the detail of their demands, including crucially whether they are proposing changes to the existing relevant criminal justice framework, such as reducing the length of sentence or enhancing the list of criminal convictions that would determine disqualification, or if they are perhaps proposing that the Election Commission be empowered to appoint some sort of independent panel to determine whether or not specific election candidates have promoted rape or violence or incited hate through their actions or words. And obviously enough, what types of politically motivated violence do Fawcett currently support? I'll post an update on this query if I ever receive a response, but they very clearly perceive Benjamin's words to have crossed a red line that somehow makes it more than just a joke. Professional comedian Omid Jalali clearly agrees, inferring that by not disavowing words presented as a joke, UKIP are now a pro-rape party. And when I pointed out that he himself had tweeted a joke about rape literally a few days previously, he clarified that from his perspective, Benjamin's comments were not a joke and were being investigated by the police, stating, "My tweet that a political consultant after his arrest and indictment would use an image of a disgraced president as a deterrent when picking up a bar of soap in a prison shower clearly is. Deal with it." However, the BBC's expert witness on the subject of offensive comedy clearly disagrees.
He is using a humorous mode. He is being ironic. He isn't offering literal description or communication. So he is engaged in joking. But jokes are never just jokes. Jokes always convey meaning. They're rhetorical in structure. They can form convincing communication. They can upset people. They can make people laugh as well.
Dr. Weaver says the research shows that some humour can release existing prejudices, and in the case of rape jokes, it can mean the crime is seen as less serious.
If research shows that some jokes can release existing prejudices, and in the case of rape jokes it can mean that crime is seen as less serious, are people like Fawcett and Omid and Jess Phillips really saying that when it comes to jokes about rape, the red line should really be jokes about raping women? After all, jokes about male rape are seen as much less taboo and taken much less seriously. Indeed, even the current chair of the all-party group on domestic violence takes the piss out of male victims from time to time.
It happens to men too, you know.
It happens to men.
Do you want a point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
Which is possibly why several days after the controversy erupted, satire website Newsload were confident enough to publish another joke involving Jess Phillips and the extremely sensitive subject of rape. Here's an excerpt. "Prisoners across the nation are entering discussions to decide whether or not they will rape UKIP candidate Carl Benjamin, following a police investigation into his recent comments towards Jess Phillips. This has led a number of his potential future roommates to ponder a similar question. He's hardly eye candy, looking like Al from Home Improvement if he was an alcoholic whose wife had banned him from seeing their kids. But on a slow day, if he dropped the soap, there's an argument to be made for bumming him into oblivion just for sport. A few of the lads aren't as fussy as me, so he's still likely to get passed around like a Camberwell carrot, regardless, but I'd probably have to see how the mood takes me. And so, if the real red line really starts and ends with jokes involving female victims of rape, then presumably Bridget Christie's perfectly written rape joke is still deemed acceptable, specifically because it punches up. For the uninitiated, punching up is a concept that originates from an unwritten rule of comedy, in which the idea is to make fun of powerful people and institutions, rather than people who have been disempowered by their acts. Christie's potentially criminal comedy transforms into a perfectly written rape joke, specifically because it punches up and explicitly targets the perpetrators of rape as opposed to the victims of their crime. But where then does this all leave comedian Richard Herring's rape joke that we considered in part 1? After all, his target is a female member of his audience, and as well as bearing a striking structural similarity to Benjamin's first joke about rape, it could also reasonably be considered as clearly punching down. Well, one person commenting on part 1 of this video proposed a distinction between two so-called rape jokes, whose authors both argue are not actually about rape. A distinction that does rather helpfully elevate only one of them above our ever-evolving red line. Specifically, Carl Benjamin isn't a comedian, and Twitter isn't a comedy club. And in fairness, Benjamin himself acknowledged that he isn't a comedian in a recent video response to an extremely slanderous and subsequently very quickly deleted fake news tweet sent to Jess Phillips from a subordinate in her feminist army, a subordinate who himself hasn't been adverse to mimicking Nazis and joking about rape.
I mean, honestly, Robert, I think there's probably a lot we can actually talk about, but not if you're just going to sit there and lie. Like, if you're just going to sit there and make things up to virtue signal, then it's really shocking. I mean, like, I'm not surprised that you had to put out a retraction saying offended YouTubers. Sorry, I could have put that better. But yeah, yeah, you could. If you're an example of TV and I'm an example of YouTube, I think we know where the talent lies, Robert. But the thing is, Robert, we're not in competition. I don't write comedy sketches. I never have. We are not we're not in competition, and you are a sad man who's virtue signaling on the internet. You're just making shit up, and you're not funny while you're doing it. And that, to me, is the biggest crime if you're going to call yourself a comedian, Robert. I'm not a comedian. I'm just a pleb with a YouTube channel. You're the comedian here who's not making anyone laugh. Actually, no, you know what? I take that back. You actually are making me laugh. You're actually, your lies are really funny. And I really hope you keep going. But like I said, please release the full transcripts of everything I ever sent you, including the emails, dated, obviously.
So anyway, to recap, the red line we need to draw to condemn Carl Benjamin has in a matter of mere moments evolved from any joke about rape to any joke about rape that targets women, punches down, or isn't told by a licensed comedian from a licensed comedy platform.
We now return to Meredith Baxter in Raped by a Clown.
It was awful. He made me do things. Awful things.
What kinds of things?
I don't even want to talk about it.
And subsequently, the other obvious question we need to consider is, should our red line only stop at rape jokes? Or are there other subjects that should fall within the scope of Fawcett's proposed public election disqualification order? Well, when interviewing Benjamin, Martin Oates, host of the BBC's South West England Sunday Politics show, suggested too, so let's consider them. Oates proposed that most people would take the view that it is unacceptable to tell jokes about the Holocaust or child abuse. And yet, as we have already discovered in part 1, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party and current mother of the House once did exactly that in a programme broadcast by none other than BBC One. So at the very least, we do very clearly seem to be establishing something of a pattern of double standards emanating from those who are very often at the front of the queue when it comes to taking offence and calling for consequences for others when it suits them best.
It's funny. We were specifically talking about not raping.
In fairness, at least Harman had the decency to acknowledge that her grotesque joke about the Holocaust wasn't remotely funny, because it very clearly punches down and specifically targets Jews. But I suppose one could argue that this Labour MP's grotesque and anti-Semitic joke comes from a very different, arguably more innocent time. Long before the likes of national treasure Stephen Fry were being accused of promoting white supremacy. So, could you get away with jokes about such sacred subjects in our stunning and brave new world? Well, judging by solely subscriber-funded platforms like Netflix, the answer is apparently still yes. Take, for example, the recent trailer of a critically acclaimed British comedy and a joke about child rape.
It's not ideal to be a fat, lazy, self-pitying lump.
Pedo!
What?
Pedo!
I'm not a pedo. And if I was, you'd be safe, you tubby little ginger cunt.
Indeed, when you really stop to think about it, the punchline to this particular rape joke, viewed over 3 million times on YouTube alone, is almost identical to the rape joke that the West Midlands Police have apparently been pondering for over a week now, and has provoked an army of feminists to demand urgent changes to the law. Except obviously the target in this case is a primary school age boy, as opposed to a 37-year-old adult elected official, which I guess says something about something. But hopefully all this does all help to highlight how complex and confusing the concept of criminalising the wrong sort of comedy could be. And at the risk of painfully mixing my metaphors, I'd suggest that we should seek to avoid potentially throwing the comedy baby out with the bathwater when throwing Benjamin onto the bus. And in my humble subjective opinion, any potential public elimination disqualification order designed to ban Carl Benjamin from standing for elected office, or anyone else deemed to have promoted rape or violence or incited hatred, obviously, should, as far as practicable, avoid comedy and instead focus on clear-cut, arguably real-world examples of actual politicians who can actually be seen to be promoting actual violence. And to do this most effectively, whilst also placating the demands of Jess Phillips' army of feminists, I propose that Carl Benjamin's unique case should be dealt with via one of two very specific exception clauses to the main disqualification criteria. Fawcett have obviously already indicated the need for a clause exempting those who would promote violence for a politically motivated cause, and I now propose a relatively narrow additional so-called comedy rape clause based along the limited set of red lines established earlier, which would allow just enough rope to meet our specific requirements, whilst as far as possibly practicable, protecting the sanctity of everyone else's right to tell a joke. All of which finally brings us to the inevitable implications that such a law might bring, and why, if Jess Phillips somehow manages to get Parliament to play along with her, then her name should be next on the list. Now, given that she's not a licensed comedian, I suppose technically speaking she could even face disqualification under the comedy rape clause, based solely on the jokes about rape contained in her recent book. But of course, ever since her recent call for the urgent disqualification of a candidate standing for a rival and pro-Brexit political party, quite a lot of people have been pointing to the fact that in 2016, in the very same week that she was talking to the BBC's Victoria Derbyshire about her latest Twitter torrent of threats to rape, she also volunteered the fact that none other than the Metropolitan Police had launched a presumably credible and presumably non-politically motivated criminal investigation into complaints that she had communicated a credible threat to kill, first published on YouTube and then conveyed to the country via the headline of a national newspaper. But of course, even though she very clearly wasn't joking, when Philip pledged to one day stab a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council, she also clearly wasn't speaking literally. And besides, I suppose the actual assassination of your actual leader would probably count as a politically motivated crime. So never mind about all that. Let's talk about the actual time she actually promoted violence, live on BBC One.
That ticking noise, by the way, is the hazard lights. I've got the RAC coming out because I've had 2 slashed tyres. So yesterday, well, let's just say in the last 4 days, I've been spat on, kicked, punched, barged, milkshaked, horse shit thrown at me and all over my vehicle and in the door handles and everything, dog shit thrown at me. I've had wankers throwing loud hailers in my face, and every other form of abuse you could possibly get by the ever-tolerant left. And for what? For following a centrist around. What the fuck has society come down to? I mean, you wouldn't think that little old Tot Ness would be quite so rabid, but hey, it's unbelievable. In the end, we had every lunatic fucking nut job that they could muster come rocking up on us and attack us. And they think they've got the moral high ground because they just simply don't subscribe to the same views. They try and shut you down completely. And at the end of the day, this is just fascism. Call it what you, they call themselves anti-fascists. But they're not open to debate either. So you can't even talk to them. These people were absolutely rabid insane. So, we're on to Exeter now. Probably get chucked in the quay, I should imagine, or something like that. So, if I make it out of this alive, I'll see you soon. Bye.
On the 25th of April 2019, a weekly BBC One current affairs and politics programme put the spotlight on a noticeable trend of so-called amateurs entering the political arena, with veteran journalist Andrew Neil proposing that politics had entered the age of the amateur, from Beppe Grillo in Italy to Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine, both comedians turned politicians, to the biggest comedian of them all, currently resident in the White House. Neil observed that Trump used his status as the ultimate outsider to disparage the competence of the political class, and then posed the question, who in politics are the real comedians? And should we be concerned when life begins to imitate art? One notable contribution to the discussion that followed was that whilst amateur status is often intended to infer someone lacking the skill of a professional, the original meaning of the word was actually intended to invoke love. Specifically, someone who does something for love, not money, and not because it's their job. And the idea that someone can be seen to be acting out of passion or love, as opposed to personal gain or careerism, can be perceived as an extremely attractive quality, one which during a time of uncertainty and political turmoil in Ukraine helped a popular centrist political outsider to secure 73% of the vote. Now, it seems highly unlikely that a supposedly pro-rape, free speech extremist is going to match such a feat anytime soon, but Carl Benjamin clearly is a political outsider, and in an era where some politicians are more likely to block you on Twitter than entertain your polite participation in a popular political political debate. He has adopted a refreshingly old-fashioned approach to his political campaign by actually stepping outside and talking to actual people in a series of town centre debates, all followed by a pint down the pub. A refreshingly British old-fashioned approach which led to one professional parliamentary public servant's recent personal highlight of the week.
Your moment, Jess.
I mean, mine is a sort of antidote to, I suppose, hatred, is the UKIP candidate who has been in the news once again this week for trolling me in the past and talking about making rape jokes.
Yes,
such a lovely fella.
On Sky too. This
Indeed.
is the chap with the beard.
The chap with the beard. Well, I shall leave him nameless. But my moment of the week was that he tried to hold like a meeting in a Beefeater, but protesters meant that he couldn't even muster a meeting in the Beefeater because the Beefeater had to stop his reservation. So, you know, the good British people are standing up against the sort of amoral trolls.
So sad.
Now, in fairness, Phillips is making something of a mountain out of a molehill out of the fact that a Bristol pub cancelled a table booking, citing fears for both staff and other guests in the event of protests by the good British people. But according to Bristol Live, the good people putting the fear into this particular Beefeater were the local faction of a so-called anti-fascist network who have been prescribed as domestic terrorists by Homeland Security in the US, working in partnership with a feminist collective called Bristol Sisterhood, who stated that Carl Benjamin's policies and hate speech attack our ideology and our integrity. For this reason, we consider it necessary to manifest ourselves and try to combat it.
If I keyed in our town?
It's not your town, is it?
It's not your town either.
Public space, but how do you know?
Public space. Because you're from fucking Swindon. Well,
so what, I'm not allowed to travel?
You're not allowed.
Thanks, man.
In this town.
I am actually allowed.
Oh, who said so? Who's authority?
Who put you in charge of the town?
No, well,
nobody, right?
Because I think people like you need to be closed the fuck down.
Fucking muppet, you're a muppet.
That's okay. How about we sit down and talk about it?
How about have a sensible
conversation? We sit down and talk about it?
Have a sensible conversation.
Oh, that was you!
Oh, it's this one.
That was you! You are literally blaming me for your hatred against what hatred?
Anyone that isn't fucking white.
What?
You say that it's good to kind of show the lefties kind of, you know, show what they really like and stuff. But at the end of the day, you were physically attacked. Someone did come over and smack your phone out of your hand. And Tommy Robinson has been seen having a milkshake thrown on him. It's the second time it's happened. And people have now started a hashtag called the Tommy Robinson Milkshake Challenge, where everywhere he goes, they're kind of saying if someone can throw a milkshake on him, they're almost like a hero.
Really?
Yeah, so do you think there is a kind of double standard when it comes to, say, Anna Soubry compared to the treatment you've been getting?
There's no question that there's a double standard. You know, it's okay when they do it, but when someone does it to us, it's not okay. You know, it's just one of those things where they're not prepared to be consistent with what they think and with their principles, and everyone can see it.
Which all does rather beg the question, exactly what type of politically motivated violence do Jess Phillips, the Labour Party and the British Broadcasting Corporation currently support? And does it extend as far as the Fawcett Society's current position of explicitly petition for special democratic dispensation for the type of politically motivated acts of violence that particularly people living in Northern Ireland have had to put up with all too long? It certainly appears to start with sending threatening messages to pubs, as well as the increasingly popular trend of throwing milkshakes at people you don't like. And if we have now definitely established a link between the online language of amateur comedians and acts of real-world violence, surely this includes performances by amateur comedians broadcast on BBC One.
Why do you think you've had kippers and milkshakes thrown over you while campaigning?
Because you're radicalising people by lying about me.
So there is a link, you say, between language and acts of violence?
There is a link between telling lies about someone in the press, and you don't seem to have any duty of care over this at all, and the things that they're trying to do, because they don't know what I stand for.
So there is a link between language, between rhetoric and acts of violence?
Yes, but you're not telling jokes. Are you telling jokes?
So it follows then that there is a link between your rape language and potential acts of violence?
No, because I was telling a joke. It was very clearly contextually a joke. This is why you have to decontextualise it in order for what you're saying to make sense.
So, In summary, if enacted, the Fawcett Society's proposed legislation imposing a lifetime ban from standing for public office on anyone found to have promoted rape or violence or incited hatred would probably lead to the automatic disqualification of some of Fawcett's favourite fellow travellers, including Jess Phillips herself, unless they are also successful in convincing Parliament to build in a get-out-of-jail-free clause for candidates advocating violence for a specific political cause. And their primary personal is politically motivated for pushing such an anti-democratic proposal in the first place is ultimately unlikely to succeed unless legislators also agree to a comedy rape clause deliberately designed to disingenuously and disproportionately impact on self-employed liberalist edgelords currently living in southeast England. But over 1 million people have recently signed a Change.org petition demanding that HBO remake the entire season of Game of Thrones with competent writers, and we can't all get what we want, no matter how hard we sometimes stamp our feet. So, one obvious question for when the dust has settled and all the votes are in is, who exactly should we be aiming our locally sourced, ethically farmed food products at next? Well, for the avoidance of any potential possible protracted confusion, I propose that we now add a previously presumed as plainly obvious presumption about public discourse between adults in the age of so-called milkshake mobs, which, by my count, leaves us with just one final oh-so-hypersensitive presumption to unpick, armed only with words.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.